The cabin stalker, a night of terror in the snow. Winters in the Colorado wilderness were brutal, but Ethan Walker had never been the type to shy away from the cold. For 5 years he had lived alone in his cabin at the edge of the forest, miles away from the nearest neighbor. It was exactly the kind of solitude he craved. No city noise, no people, just the quiet of nature. He had spent years learning how to handle the fierce winter storms, how to stockpile food, how to prepare for long nights when the snow piled too high to drive out. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened that night. The storm rolled in faster than expected. By early evening, thick snowflakes tumbled from the sky, turning the winding road to his cabin into a treacherous path. Ethan had closed up his small hardware store early, urging his staff to head home before the roads became impassable. By the time he reached his cabin, the world outside was already buried in white. The wind roared like a living beast, shaking the trees, rattling the windows. But inside, everything was warm, safe. After struggling to clear enough space in his driveway to park, he locked the door behind him, kicked off his boots, and cranked up the heater. Snow piled against the windows in thick drifts, and the wind howled through the pines like a chorus of unseen voices. Ethan poured himself a glass of bourbon, settled into his worn-out recliner, and let the storm rage outside while he enjoyed the stillness of his home. Nights like these reminded him why he chose to live here, far from the chaos of the world, where he could sit back and enjoy the sound of nothing but nature. Until the knock. Ethan froze, the glass halfway to his lips. He wasn't expecting anyone. No one should be here. His nearest neighbor was over 4 miles away, and even if someone's car had broken down, they wouldn't be knocking on his door in the middle of a blizzard. Slowly, he set his glass down and stood, listening. The wind roared against the cabin walls, but beyond that, nothing. Maybe he had imagined it. The storm could play tricks on the mind. Still, his gut told him something was off. He walked to the front window and pulled the curtain aside, peering out into the swirling snow. The porch light cast a dim glow, illuminating the thick drifts of fresh snow covering his front yard. No one was there, but then he saw them. Footprints. His stomach tightened. A trail of boot prints led straight up to his door, and then back down the steps. A chill ran through him that had nothing to do with the weather. Whoever had knocked hadn't waited for him to answer. They had come right up to his door, knocked, and then walked away. Or were they still out there, hiding just beyond the reach of the light? Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears as he stepped back from the window. He locked the door, double-checked it, and grabbed the shotgun he kept in the hall closet. It wasn't loaded, but just the feel of it in his hands gave him a sense of control. He told himself it was nothing, probably just some lost hiker looking for shelter. But deep down, he knew better. No one would be hiking in a storm like this. An hour passed. Then came the second knock. This time, it wasn't at the front door. It came from the side of the house, near the kitchen window. Ethan's blood ran cold. His cabin sat in a clearing with nothing but dense forest surrounding it. If someone was moving around his house, they were circling him. Gripping the shotgun tightly, he crept toward the kitchen. The window was completely frosted over, making it impossible to see outside. He reached out and flipped off the lights, plunging the room into darkness. Then, he picked up his flashlight and aimed it at the window, clicking it on. Nothing. The snow outside was untouched, no footprints, no movement. But he had heard it. A loud knock, as real as the first. His heart pounded in his chest. Someone, or something, was playing with him. For a long moment, Ethan stood frozen, waiting, listening. The wind screamed outside, rattling the trees so hard they groaned under the pressure. But beyond that, the night was silent. Finally, after what felt like forever, he turned the lights back on, locked every window, and went to bed, his shotgun resting on the nightstand. He didn't expect to sleep, but exhaustion eventually took over. Until the third knock woke him. This time it was at the back of the house. The sliding glass door? Ethan bolted upright, his breath coming in quick, panicked gasps. The knock had been louder than before, more insistent, like whoever, or whatever, was outside was getting impatient. Grabbing the flashlight, he crept down the hall, stepping carefully, heart pounding so hard it was deafening. He reached the glass door and froze. The curtain was open. He was sure he had closed it before going to bed. He flicked on the flashlight and aimed it outside. The deck beyond the glass was empty. The snow covering it was undisturbed. No footprints, no sign that anyone had ever been there. Ethan stood there, shaking, struggling to make sense of it. The knocks were real, he had heard them. But if there were no footprints in the snow, then who had knocked? Or worse, what? The rest of the night was a nightmare. The knocking didn't stop. It moved around the house, tapping at the windows, the walls, the doors, sometimes soft, sometimes loud. At one point, Ethan swore he heard footsteps crunching in the snow, but every time he looked outside, nothing. The storm was too fierce to go outside and check. Even if he wanted to, what would he do? Chase after nothing? By the time morning came, Ethan felt like he was losing his mind. The storm had settled, leaving the world in an eerie, snow-blanketed silence. That's when he stepped outside, and his stomach dropped. Footprints. They were everywhere. Boot prints circled his cabin, weaving between the windows and doors. Someone, or something, had spent hours walking around his home, watching. Then he followed the tracks to the edge of the woods. That's when he saw it. Snowmobile tracks. Whoever had been outside his cabin wasn't lost. They had come prepared. Ethan stood there for a long time, staring at the tracks disappearing into the trees, his breath curling in the frigid air. Who had been watching him? What did they want? And, more importantly, would they come back? That night, Ethan made a decision. He wasn't going to be caught off guard again. From then on, he kept the shotgun loaded. He installed cameras around the property. He double-checked his locks every night. And every winter, when the snowstorms return, when the wind howls through the trees like voices whispering in the dark, he wonders if they will return. And if they do, this time he'll be ready. The ice fisherman's warning, a nightmare on the frozen lake. There was something about the silence of a frozen lake in winter that always brought Mason Carter peace. The crisp air, the snow-covered wilderness stretching for miles, and the smooth, unbroken ice beneath him. It was his sanctuary. Living in Minnesota for most of his life, Mason had been ice fishing since he was a kid, tagging along with his grandfather before he could even hold a rod properly. Even after his grandfather passed, Mason still carried on the tradition, finding solace in the quiet isolation of the frozen waters. But that day, the one he would never forget, changed everything. The blizzard had been forecasted, but Mason wasn't worried. The ice on Echo Lake was over a foot thick, strong enough to hold trucks, let alone a man with a small shack and a sled full of gear. It was perfect fishing weather. The kind of day where few dared to venture out, leaving the entire lake to himself. No distractions, no competition, just him, the ice, and the promise of a big catch. He arrived just before noon, his truck skidding slightly as he pulled into the empty parking lot. The lake stretched out before him, a vast sheet of white beneath an ominous gray sky. Snowflakes drifted lazily down, thick and heavy, coating the world in an eerie quiet. The storm wasn't supposed to hit until later that night, giving him more than enough time to fish before heading home. Dragging his sled out onto the lake, Mason walked about half a mile from shore, far enough to avoid the usual fishing spots. He drilled his holes, set up his small portable shack, and turned on the propane heater. The inside was warm and safe, a cocoon of comfort against the brutal cold outside. He settled in, baited his line, and let out a satisfied sigh as the wind howled across the ice. Then he saw him. Through the frost-coated window, barely visible through the swirling snow, a dark figure stood motionless in the distance. Mason squinted, his heart skipping a beat. He wasn't expecting anyone else out here. No other trucks were in the lot. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching. Mason felt an uneasy chill creep up his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He told himself it was just another fisherman, maybe someone from the other side of the lake who had hiked out. But why was he just standing there? Why wasn't he setting up a shack or drilling holes? Shaking off his unease, Mason focused back on his line, brushing the thought aside. He wasn't about to let some weird guy ruin his day. Minutes passed, then an hour. When he looked again, the figure was gone. The storm had thickened, the wind howling louder, and Mason could barely see past 20 feet now. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Probably just his imagination. The snow could play tricks on the eyes, shifting shapes in the distance. Then came the knocking. 3 sharp raps against the side of his shack. Mason nearly jumped out of his seat. He spun around, staring at the fabric walls of his shelter. Someone was outside. His mind raced. The figure. It had to be him. But why knock? Why not just say something? His pulse pounded in his ears as he unzipped the door a few inches, just enough to peek outside. The snow whipped around him, thick and blinding. No one was there. His breath came in short gasps as he stepped out completely, scanning the area. The ice stretched out in all directions, a white void of nothingness. But the footprints were there, leading right up to his shack, then disappearing completely. Mason's stomach twisted. There were no retreating steps, no sign of someone walking away, just a trail of deep, crisp footprints ending abruptly a few feet away. Like whoever had been standing there had simply vanished. His breath fogged in the freezing air as he swallowed hard, every instinct in his body screaming that something wasn't right. He turned back to his shack, deciding he'd had enough for the day. That's when he heard the voice. "You shouldn't be out here." Mason whirled around. He was there. A man stood about 10 feet away, partially obscured by the blowing snow. He was wrapped in an old, tattered coat, his face mostly hidden by a scarf. Mason's skin prickled. "Jesus, man, you scared the hell out of me. What do you want?" The stranger didn't move. He just stared with an unsettling stillness. Then he spoke again. "The ice isn't safe." Mason frowned. "What are you talking about? It's over a foot thick. I measured it myself." The man didn't blink. Not today. Something about the way he said it made Mason's stomach twist. "Listen," Mason said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't know what kind of joke this is, but I don't need some weird cryptic warning. I've been fishing here for years." The stranger tilted his head slightly. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Within seconds, he disappeared into the storm. Mason stood there, shaken, heart still hammering. What the hell was that? Some crazy local trying to scare him off? He exhaled sharply and shook his head. Then, the ice cracked. A loud, sickening pop echoed beneath his feet. Mason's breath hitched. He turned toward his shack and saw the ice fracturing. Thin, jagged lines spread outward like veins in glass. He took a step back, his boots slipping on the surface. The cracks were growing. The man's warning rang in his ears. Not today. Panic surged through him as he bolted toward the shore. The ice groaned beneath him, the sound of splitting frozen water following his every step. Behind him, his shack collapsed, the ice beneath it shattering. A massive hole opened in the lake, swallowing everything. His gear, his heater, gone. Mason ran harder, lungs burning, barely reaching solid ground before the cracks stopped spreading. He turned, gasping, his entire body trembling. His fishing spot was gone, a gaping black hole where solid ice had been just minutes before. His mind reeled. He had checked the thickness. It had been safe. Hadn't it? His eyes darted across the lake, searching for any sign of the man who had warned him. There was nothing. No footprints, no tracks, no evidence that anyone had ever been there. Mason staggered back to his truck in a daze, barely registering the drive home. That night, as he sat in his warm house, the event played over in his mind like a looping nightmare. Who was that man? How had he known? And if Mason had ignored the warning, would he have drowned? He never went back to Echo Lake, never fished there again. Because somewhere out there, in the middle of the ice, something had been waiting. And Mason wasn't about to find out what, the stranger in the cabin, a snowstorm nightmare. The wind howled through the mountains, rattling the wooden walls of the small rental cabin as snowflakes pelted against the glass windows. It had been snowing for hours, thick sheets of white burying the winding road that led to this secluded hideaway deep in the Oregon wilderness. To Noah Carter, this was exactly what he wanted. A weekend away from the noise, the city, the stress of his construction job. Just a crackling fireplace, a warm mug of coffee, and the comforting solitude of an empty cabin nestled in the woods. Or at least that's what he thought. Something was off the moment he stepped inside. The cabin looked just like the listing online, a quaint, rustic, stocked with firewood. But as he kicked off his boots and shook the snow from his jacket, his eyes landed on the kitchen sink. Dirty dishes. A couple of mugs, a plate, a pan with dried-up grease. Noah frowned. The rental company had promised the place would be cleaned before his arrival. Maybe the last guests had left in a hurry. Maybe the cleaning crew just forgot? It was annoying, sure, but not enough to ruin his trip. He sighed, rinsed the dishes, and moved on. But that sense of unease had already settled deep in his gut. And it didn't stop there. As he unpacked in the bedroom, he noticed the bed was unmade, the sheets rumpled, the pillows slightly indented, as if someone had been lying there just moments ago. Noah pressed his hand against the mattress. Still warm. He yanked his hand back like he'd been burned. His pulse quickened. Had someone been here? 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind. Maybe the rental company had double-booked the place. Maybe a squatter had been living here. But the cabin was silent. No sounds, no movement. Just the wind shrieking outside. Forcing himself to shake it off, he made his way back to the living room, adding a few more logs to the fire. The warmth spread through the cabin, chasing away the chill. And still, the unease lingered. Noah tried to distract himself. He made dinner, poured a glass of whiskey, and curled up by the fire with a book. The storm outside had worsened, snow piling high against the porch railing. By 10 p.m., exhaustion crept in, and he decided to call it a night. Before heading to bed, he double-checked the locks. Front door, locked. Back door, locked. Windows, locked. Satisfied, he crawled under the covers, letting the firelight flicker across the ceiling. He was asleep within minutes, until the sound woke him. At first it was faint, a soft creak, a subtle shift of weight against the wooden floor. Noah's eyes snapped open. He held his breath. The wind was still screaming outside, but inside the cabin was supposed to be still. Then, another creak. Footsteps, coming from the hallway. A chill ran down Noah's spine. He grabbed his phone from the nightstand, clicking on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness as he swung his legs over the bed, his heart hammering. He forced himself to listen. Silence. Then, another creak. Closer. Noah's mouth went dry. He wasn't alone. With slow, careful movements, he stood. The air felt heavy, suffocating, charged with something unseen. He crept toward the bedroom door, every muscle in his body taut. He flung the door open. Nothing. The hallway was empty, but the unease didn't fade. His flashlight swept across the cabin. The furniture was untouched. The fire had burned down to embers. Everything looked normal. Then, his gaze landed on the back door. His stomach dropped. The deadbolt was unlocked. He knew he had locked it. He had checked it twice. Noah's breath came in shallow gasps. Someone had been inside. The realization sent a jolt of fear down his spine. He snatched his keys from the counter, grabbed his coat, and bolted for the front door. He yanked it open, ready to flee into the storm, and froze. Footprints, leading away from the cabin, not toward it, not stopping at the back door. They started at the back door and walked into the woods. Noah's blood ran cold. Whoever had been inside had been hiding here the whole time. They had waited until he fell asleep, and then they had simply walked out. Noah's mind reeled. Where had they been? The attic? The crawl space? Had they been watching him? He turned, eyes darting to the tree line. The footprints disappeared into the dense forest, swallowed by the storm. A prickling sensation crept up his neck. Was someone still watching him? The thought made his skin crawl. Noah didn't waste another second. He slammed the door shut, threw the deadbolt, and grabbed his phone. No service. His heart pounded. He couldn't stay here. He moved fast, grabbing his keys, throwing his gear into his bag. But as he reached for the door again, something stopped him. A sound. from under the floorboards. A slow, deliberate scratch. Long, drawn out, like fingernails against wood. Noah's breath hitched. There was a crawl space beneath the cabin. He hadn't checked it. He didn't want to check it. His entire body screamed at him to run. Without looking back, he ripped open the door, barreling into the snowstorm. He didn't care that his truck was buried in snow. He didn't care that his tires skidded on the icy road. He just drove. He didn't stop. Didn't breathe until the cabin was a distant memory in his rearview mirror. By the time he reached town, the storm had calmed. He pulled into a gas station, hands trembling as he dialed the rental company. Their response? Silence. Then, hesitation. Are you sure no one else was staying there? Noah's stomach churned. There were dirty dishes, a warm bed, unlocked doors. The line crackled. Finally, the voice on the other end said, "Sir, that cabin hasn't been rented for months." The phone slipped from his hands. His pulse roared in his ears. Because if no one had rented it, who had been living there? And more importantly, were they ever really gone? The silent passenger, a taxi ride into terror. The city was unnervingly quiet that night. The neon glow of streetlights flickered against the damp pavement as raindrops smeared across the cab's windshield. It was past midnight and Evelyn Harper was exhausted from her flight, her body aching from the cramped hours spent in an airplane seat. She had been traveling for work, a quick 3-day business trip that had left her drained and eager to get home. The airport was nearly deserted when she finally stepped outside, the cold air wrapping around her like an unwelcome embrace. The usual line of taxis was sparse, only a few scattered vehicles waiting at the curb. Evelyn hated ride-sharing apps, preferring the reliability of old-fashioned taxis. So when a yellow cab rolled up with its headlights cutting through the misty night, she barely hesitated before stepping forward. She approached the passenger window, peering in. The driver, a man in his late 40s with short graying hair and a hollow gaze, gave her a small nod. "Need a ride?" His voice was gruff but not unfriendly. Evelyn gave him her address, and after a quick nod, he unlocked the back door. The interior smelled faintly of stale coffee and something else. Something off. But she brushed the thought aside, sinking into the back seat with relief. As the cab pulled onto the highway, the silence between them grew thick. The only sounds were the rhythmic swipes of the windshield wipers and the occasional hum of the engine. Evelyn stared out at the passing streetlights, her exhaustion making the world blur. That's when she noticed it. The driver was watching her, not directly but through the rearview mirror. The first time she caught his gaze, she thought she imagined it, a flicker of his eyes in the reflection, quickly shifting away when she looked up. But then it happened again, and again. Every time she checked, his eyes were there, watching her. Her fingers curled into her lap, stomach twisting with unease. Maybe he was just making sure she wasn't asleep? Maybe this was normal? But why did it feel so wrong? The city lights grew distant as they veered off onto a darker road, an empty stretch of highway leading toward her neighborhood. The discomfort settled deep in Evelyn's chest. Then, the driver spoke. "You travel alone, often?" The question sent a chill down her spine. She forced a casual tone. "Not really, just for work." The driver hummed, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. "Pretty woman like you shouldn't be alone this late." A rush of unease flooded her veins. The way he said it, so casual, yet so deliberate. Evelyn forced a polite laugh. "I manage," the driver chuckled, shaking his head. "Bet you got a boyfriend waiting for you at home, huh?" She hesitated, too long. His fingers tightened on the wheel. "Yeah," she lied quickly. "He's waiting for me, probably wondering where I am." The driver's jaw clenched, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the steering wheel. The tension in the cab thickened, suffocating. Then, he missed her exit. Evelyn's stomach dropped. "That was my turn," she said, voice steady despite the panic rising in her throat. The driver didn't slow down. "Don't worry," he muttered. "I'll take the next one." Evelyn's heart pounded against her ribs. She glanced at her phone. No signal. The road stretched ahead, empty and dark, no sign of traffic. No one to see her if she screamed. She tried again, voice firmer. "Can you pull over? I think I left something back at the airport." The driver didn't respond. His grip on the wheel was too tight, his posture too stiff. Something was wrong. Evelyn's fingers hovered over the door handle. Was it locked? The cab sped up. Panic surged through her veins. She wasn't going home. She was going somewhere else. That's when she saw it. Up ahead, a red light at a deserted intersection. Her chance. The moment the cab slowed, she grabbed the handle and yanked. Locked. The driver laughed. A low, guttural sound that sent a chill down her spine. "You really think I didn't see that coming?" Evelyn's breath hitched. Her pulse roared in her ears. The light turned green. The cab lurched forward. Evelyn's mind raced. She reached into her bag, fingers closing around the cold metal of her pepper spray. She had one shot. With all her strength, she sprayed directly into his eyes. The driver let out a blood-curdling scream, jerking the wheel. The cab swerved violently. Tires screeched against the pavement. Evelyn braced herself as the car skidded off the road, crashing into a ditch. For a split second, silence. Then, movement. The driver groaned, his body shifting. Evelyn didn't wait. She kicked the door. Again, until finally it gave way. She stumbled into the cold night air, running toward the only light in the distance, a gas station. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she didn't stop. She didn't dare look back. A bell jingled as she burst through the gas station doors, gasping for air. The clerk looked up, startled. "Call the police," she choked out. And then, behind her, headlights. The cab had pulled up outside. The driver was coming. But before he could step out, sirens. Red and blue lights flashed across the wet pavement. The driver froze. Two officers approached, guns drawn. Evelyn sank against the counter, heart hammering. The next few moments blurred. The police pulling the driver from the cab, his protests, his furious glare as they cuffed him. She watched in shock as they searched the trunk and found zip ties, a knife, a roll of duct tape. Her stomach twisted. He had planned this. He had been waiting for someone like her. Hours later at the station, she learned the truth. He wasn't a real taxi driver. The cab had been stolen, and she had almost become another missing person case. Sitting in the sterile police station, wrapped in a blanket, Evelyn thought about all the ways that night could have ended, and how, if she hadn't fought back, it would have. She stared at the officer across from her. "What would have happened if I got in his truck?" she whispered. The officer didn't answer. He didn't have to. The four chilling stories we just explored are more than just tales of terror. They serve as stark reminders of the dangers lurking in the real world. Whether it's a stranger stalking you on a deserted road, a cab driver taking you somewhere you were never meant to go, an intruder hiding in your safe space, or an unseen presence knocking in the dead of night, these encounters prove that danger often arrives when we least expect it. The lesson? Trust your instincts. If something feels off, don't dismiss it. Stay aware of your surroundings. Always have an exit plan. And never hesitate to take action when your gut tells you something is wrong. Your survival could depend on it. If these stories sent chills down your spine, imagine how many real-life horrors go unnoticed every day. Don't let the darkness catch you unprepared. Subscribe to Johan Horror for bone-chilling, true horror stories, real-life lessons, and cautionary tales that just might save your life. Turn on notifications, because in a world full of shadows, you never know when the next nightmare could become your reality. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching. Subscribe now.